Welcome to the Friday edition of Juan's World. And as it happens, this week is an interesting week in the period between Easter and Pentecost. I have usually labeled these episodes as Unpacking Easter, but an awful lot of the time I haven't actually been talking much about Easter. I've been cooking or just rambling on about education or something like that, and I'm going to be doing the same today. I'm not excusing that, but I do want to point out that this week there are two important holidays, and by coincidence they're happening on the same day this year. Normally they don't, but they are this year. The first is Corpus Christi. Corpus Christi is May 26th, and it's fixed on May 26th as the feast that, in some, I guess, theological sense, focuses on the general Roman Catholic belief that the bread and wine of communion, at the words of institution, turned into the literal body and blood of Jesus, which is one of the things that separates Catholic dogma from Protestant dogma. Protestant dogma is a little bit complicated because Martin Luther didn't exactly think in terms of the literal body and blood, but wasn't quite willing to give it up entirely, whereas some of the other theologians, such as John Calvin, were able to just say, no, it's bread and wine, and that's it. It doesn't turn into anything else, and we do the sacrament as a memorial, not because of any magical transformation. Because for a long time, people had wanted to know, how is it that if it is the body and blood of Christ, it still looks like bread and wine? And so they had all of this philosophical rambling about it and whatnot. Anyway, so that's the 26th, is the celebration of the body and blood of Christ. And also, this year, by coincidence, on the 26th, is Ascension Thursday. Now, Ascension Thursday is 40 days from Easter and marks the ascension of Jesus into heaven, as recorded in the book of Acts. And it's always a Thursday, and so by coincidence Corpus Christi happens to be a Thursday this year, but that's very, very unusual. So Ascension Thursday marks Jesus' ascension physically into heaven, and so the disciples are now completely on their own, which leads us inevitably to Pentecost Sunday, which will be June 5th, so a couple of Sundays away, when the Holy Spirit descends on them, in a sense to replace the physical presence of Jesus, and is part of the doctrine of the Trinity, etc., etc. And I don't want to get into any of that at the moment. Maybe around Pentecost Sunday I'll get into it more, but just to note that this week is full of important feasts, and if you are unpacking Easter, you should be paying attention. But I want to talk about, both today and I think next time and maybe the time after, is still in the vein of my ideas of education and teaching. And what I'm interested in is how people come to view certain intellectuals in a negative light without ever reading what they wrote. And the two that I want to focus on most particularly are Sigmund Freud and Karl Marx. But I've also added in my title Albert Einstein. People don't read Albert Einstein because they don't understand him. And I would venture to say that people don't read Freud or Marx because they don't understand them either. But also the more general point, which I made a very long time ago, which is that people just don't read. They accept the popular opinion of Freud and Marx, and that's it. And the popular opinion is, oh, Freud and Marx are wrong, so I don't need to bother with them. I don't even need to read them. You're wrong. You do need to read them. Let's talk about that. Now, I used to teach Freud and Marx every year. When I first started teaching as an assistant professor in the SUNY system, I was hired to teach what was called freshman studies, which is kind of a general introduction to big thinkers. Not a great course in a lot of ways, because it focused on pretty standard stuff. In the second semester, what was really important to me was that it focused on what we call modernism. And modernism is kind of shorthand for the modern way of thinking in terms of science, in terms of psychology, in terms of art and literature, a whole range of things. And modernism is not a very good term, and it has all kinds of holes in it. But two of the most important intellectuals of the modernist era were Freud and Marx. And Freud developed psychoanalysis, and Marx developed political economy, a form of economic theory, like mixed together with political and historical theory. And for one reason or another, both of them are considered to be just like outdated. Well, they are. I mean, like straight up, they are. They are wrong about a lot of things. Okay, no argument from me. They are also right about a lot of things. And that's why you've got to read them. And you've got to read them critically. You've got to read them asking, is this an accurate portrayal of a psychoanalytic phenomenon or a political phenomenon or whatever? Do I trust this? What is the evidence? All of the things that I've been talking about all along. So let's just start with Freud for today. And let me point out all the ways in which he was right. And, well, not all the ways, a few of the ways. And a few of the ways in which he was just dead wrong. Now, both Marx and Freud unfortunately relied on the anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan. Lewis Henry Morgan was writing in the mid-19th century, and his basic idea was what we now call general cultural evolution. That is, that all cultures can be arrayed on a spectrum from the most primitive, which he called savage, to the most modern, which he calls civilized. And they went through various stages of savagery, lower, middle, upper, barbarism, lower, middle, upper, to civilization. And that every society was on the same track. And each track had its own system of the way the world works, what we call worldview. He believed that savage people believed in magic, barbaric people believed in religion, and civilized people believed in science. They had their own marriage systems, their own kinship systems, their own technologies. You know, that savage people had stone tools and developed various things like the bow and arrow and whatnot, and then you move on to the technology of barbarism and so forth. All right. Freud and Marx depended on Lewis Henry Morgan's theories, particularly in two very, very large volumes that were the most, if you like, authoritative anthropology of their day. And Lewis Henry Morgan was 100% wrong. He was completely wrong. American anthropology under Franz Boas at the turn of the 20th century upended Lewis Henry Morgan completely. They did leave in place his theory of kinship in a very general way, but the whole idea of cultural evolution, the whole idea that every culture is going through these various stages, and if anything, you know, if you're at the civilized stage, then you're meant to help the people at the savage stage or the barbaric stage to come forward, which was a sort of, you know, unsubtle justification for colonialism. Like, we are the scientific civilized people, we're going to go ahead and civilize people with our knowledge, and well, we may enslave them, but you know, that's for their own good. Right? Okay, Morgan got tossed out, and so the foundations of both Freudian theory and Marxist theory are wrong. Right? So that, check that off in the wrong list. Completely wrong. So Freud has no real understanding of prehistory. He no knowledge of how people lived as early hominids. You know, like in the Stone Age, we still do actually use the concept of Stone Age, although we usually use the term Paleolithic just to hide the fact that we're talking about the stone. Paleolithic literally means old stones. Then there's the Neolithic, when people invented the domestication of plants and animals, and then moved on from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age and so forth. That conception still has some merit, but the idea that primitive people or non-Western people are somehow wrong or inferior because they haven't caught up with civilization is just incorrect. And that's the theory that Freud was working on. Freud had this idea that somehow or other, in some kind of misty past, human sexuality was very like global, where like you could have sex with anybody, have sex with your mother, your father, brother and sister. Like everyone pretty much could have sex with everybody else, because there was no morality, right? There's no conception of what's good and bad. Well, actually, if he had read Morgan properly, or if he'd read the right book, Systems of Consanguinity, he would have discovered that that's nonsense. But he didn't. He thought that the primitive band or tribe or whatever he called it was just like sexually promiscuous. And that the big step forward was the invention of the incest taboo. And you'll find this in a very, very slim volume that he wrote, and that I used to teach all the time, called Totem and Taboo. And in it he explains how the father, mother, brothers, sisters were all, pretty much sexually promiscuous. But that at some point they realized, and I don't quite know how they realized this, Freud doesn't explain, but that somehow or other they realized that this was wrong, that the father had to be respected, and the mother had to be respected, and the brothers and sisters had to go and seek partners for sex and marriage outside of the family. And this was the birth of the Oedipal complex. Remember Oedipus had sex with his mother and killed his father, and Freud's idea is that every child, or every male child anyway, stick there for the moment, every male child loves his mother, but loves her like physically, because from birth he's been nurturing at her breasts and been physically comforted by her, and that it seems natural that love should turn into sexual love when the child reaches sexual maturity. But the problem is that if the mother loves the son in the same way, then her husband, the child's father, is going to be jealous, and he's stronger and more powerful. He's going to kill the boy. And the boy realizes this, and so puts a big wall around mother. It's like can't touch her, and identifies with the father, takes on his characteristics, and that includes his sense of self and his sense of morality. In a sense, everything having to do with the culture. And he goes off and he finds a bride somewhere else. And that's not only psychologically functional, but also culturally functional, because by making a relationship with another family, you now have a stronger unit. You have two families working together because they're bonded by marriage. All right, well, most of that is nonsense. There are elements that are okay in it, but the idea that boys internalize their fathers in what Freud called the superego, in the methods that he's talking about, are just not acceptable at all in terms of modern psychological theory. The idea that all boys want to have sex with their mothers is also nonsense. Now, it is certainly the case that Freud had a strange sexual connection with his mother. Never, I mean, like not in any active sense, but he had some feelings that we would consider to be a bit strange. And okay, fine, but you don't generalize your feelings for your mother to every boy's feelings for every mother in the world. You don't generalize conceptions of motherhood and so forth. But we have to admit one important thing, that the incest taboo does exist. And the strange thing about the incest taboo is that it is not particular. That there are cultures, or have been cultures, where brothers and sisters can get married. The most a classic example is the pharaohs of ancient Egypt, who routinely married between brothers and sisters. Cleopatra married both of her brothers at one point. Not clear whether she had sex with them, but she married them. And it's a bit hard to kind of delve back to those ancient times. But it does seem that sometimes brother and sister marriages between pharaohs produced offspring. First cousin marriage is quite common in many cultures for various reasons, and it's incestuous in others. In some cultures there's a difference between what are called parallel cousins and cross cousins. A parallel cousin is a cousin who's related to you through siblings of the same sex. So your mother's sister's children, so your mother and their sister, they're both female, their children are parallel cousins. Your father's brother's children, also parallel cousins. In most cultures that allow cousin marriage, parallel cousins are generally not allowed. They are incestuous. Whereas cross cousins, that is the children of siblings of opposite sex, so the children of your father's sister or your mother's brother in particular, very important relationship. Those children are called cross cousins, and that's quite common. That's not incestuous. So we have to think of incest not as a series of absolute rules, but of rules that are related to a particular culture, and so they can change, except one. There is no culture in the world that allows mother-son sexual relations. None. There are not very many that allow father-daughter, but they're not entirely forbidden universally. They're very, very rare, but they are allowed. Mother-son relations are incestuous in the entire world. Now there has to be some truth, therefore, to Freud's speculation. I wouldn't say in exact terms, but in general, and you can see that's going to have a severe impact on a family. If a mother loves her son more than her husband, it's not good for the family. It's disastrous. And it's going to lead to problems of jealousy and violence and all kinds of things. So on that point, he was accurate. He also incidentally invented what was called the talking cure. That is, that if you have psychological problems, one of the ways that you can overcome them is by talking about them to a professional, to somebody who understands the mechanics of human psychology and who can help guide, steer, advise, interpret, what have you. Freud used various mechanisms, including the interpretation of dreams, as his avenue into what he called the unconscious, the part of your memory that you don't have an immediate awareness of, but which is still triggering your behavior. And it could be going all the way back to things that happened in your childhood. Now again, there's a lot of problems with Freudian theory having to do with childhood, having to do with what's called the psychosexual stages of development, his theory about the oral, the anal, and the phallic, penis envy, on and on and on. Yeah, he was wrong about a lot of things, but not about everything. And the most significant thing, as far as I'm concerned, is his spotlight on the unconscious, which became like universally accepted in Euro-American consciousness, in therapy and so forth, to the point where this, nowadays, the vast majority of people, certainly not in Asia, like let's get that straight. We're talking about Euro-America, particularly the United States. Most people have a therapist. Well, that's not very Freudian at all. Like Freud said, you go to a therapist for one reason only, and that is that you have a problem that you want to fix. Like, you don't go to a therapist because you need a friend. Right? You need somebody to advise you about getting a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or because you're miserable most of the time because of the news or something. Like, you go for a specific problem, and you go because you conceive of it as a problem, not in any absolute sense, but because you don't want it for whatever it is. You go to a therapist, and that therapist will help you solve that one problem. But that became this gigantic industry, which now has bloomed and blossomed and ballooned into an enormous business. That's not where Freud was heading. So yes, Freud was wrong about a lot of things. He was also right about a lot of things. And your task, till we meet again, is to read some Freud, to read critically, and to make up your own mind. Was he right about this? Was he right about what we call Freudian slips? Now, Freudian slip is a mistake you make where you jumble up what's in your conscious mind with what's in your unconscious mind, so that what you unconsciously intended slips out. Freudian slip. I can't tell you how many times I had young women come to my office hours, trying not to engage me in any kind of intimate way, although they had certain feelings. And I'll have to say that I was younger. I'm talking about when I was in my late 20s and early 30s, and they were in their early 20s, so it was reasonable. So they'd come to me for some kind of counseling, and then leave their dorm keys behind on my desk, which is such a classic Freudian slip. I want you to come to my bedroom. And of course, if I ever said anything to them in those terms, then they would be, in denial and embarrassed and all the rest of it. And Freud's idea was that they don't even recognize their intentions because they're unconscious. Okay, well that's, it's not a great theory, but it's not entirely wrong. There's lots of things about Freud that are not entirely wrong. Read Civilization and Its Discontents, but read it critically. Or read Totem and Taboo. Read it critically. That's my important lesson for the last week or more, and will continue into the future. Read these people, but read them critically, and be critical of me also. But at minimum, please subscribe to my channel, please like, please tell your friends, and I'll see you on the other side of the weekend. Have a good weekend.